Hello and welcome to another episode of the Booknotes season of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. My name is Pilar and I am back. This time I'm back on my own after last week, but it wasn't last week's episode. It was a few weeks ago with the co-author Bri Kajati where we talked about connection and disconnection in remote teams. I am back today to share my notes with you, the notes that I've made when reading a book. And today's book, I'm still reading it, I have to say, but I'm already about 56% and it's nonfiction, which means I'm getting towards the last third of the book. I'm really enjoying it, so I'm very happy to recommend it to you, even though I haven't finished it yet. So the book is Black Box Thinking, Growth Mindset and the Secrets of High Performance by Matthew Syed. And I'm really enjoying it. It's one of these books. It's very similar. It reminds me to Malcolm Gladwell, maybe even Adam Grant, which is we learn the lessons from stories and not mainly from the world of business, actually. I really am enjoying this book because it looks at the aviation industry. It looks at the health industry. It's looking at crime as well. And I think that's more or less it at the moment. It's looking at development as well as in global economic development. And so for me, it's interesting because I'm very curious and it's very easy to read, as in it just flows very well. It doesn't dwell on anything, but it goes into quite a lot of detail of the case studies. So I'm really enjoying it. And it really is about failure, identifying failure, recognizing failure, and why it is so difficult to do so. It's all very well when we're talking about psychological safety to say, oh, people have to be allowed to make mistakes and all of this, which is hard in itself, but actually it's difficult to admit to a mistake. I think this is what I'm taking from the book more than anything. It's how much we want to hang on to our opinions and protect our ego, even subconsciously, and how that gets in the way of our development. So when it talks about growth mindset and the secrets of high performance, I'm going to read you one of my notes, which says, the paradox of success, it is built upon failure. Basically, it's saying we hear about all these successes, but everything that happened beforehand, all the failures that happened beforehand are what makes a success. So I will share more of these notes, and then in the second half or second bit of the episode, I will share some personal updates. All right, so I will leave the stories for you to read if you enjoy this book. And I have to say that Matthew Syed also has another book I read a while ago about diversity called Rebel Ideas, The Power of Diverse Thinking. And I have to say I read that before I read this one. I really enjoyed it. I talked about it at some point. Maybe I'll come back to it. Let me know. Let me know if you want to hear my thoughts. It's just what I've highlighted from Rebel Ideas. Pilar at virtualnotdistant.com is the email that you can still use. But let's get back to this episode. As you know, divergent thinking is my specialty and tangents are my specialty. While I get the PDF on this iPad out. So as I was saying, I will not share many of the specific stories. I have some examples that have really stayed with me. So go and read those. But, okay, what do we mean by creating this culture of success? It is about creating systems and cultures that enable organizations to learn from errors rather than being threatened by them. A few pages later, there's another highlight that goes very well with this one. It is about method and mindset. So it's all very well saying we're going to have this way of recording mistakes. If we haven't changed the mindset that actually in order to be successful, we have to admit to failure and then learn from them. Another one. Failure is rich in learning opportunities for a simple reason. In many of its guises, it represents a violation of expectation. It is showing us that the world is, in some sense, different from the way we imagined it to be. I love that. I never thought about failure, getting things wrong from that point of view. It's difficult because it really is violating our expectations. And it's saying, hey, You imagined it to be in this way and it's turned out to be in this way. And then from there, I think you can go, why, etc. All of that nice stuff. And then, you know what? I'm just going to read the next ones. Feedback when delayed is considerably less effective in improving intuitive judgment. I think that's talking about how our intuition is built upon learning and things we've learned. By looking only at the theories that have survived, we don't notice the failures that made them possible. If a culture is open and honest about mistakes, the entire system can learn from them. And then it talks about those cultures where mistakes are welcome, actually, because we can learn from them. Those who reported mistakes were surprised to learn that, except in situations where they had been clearly reckless, they were praised, not punished. And interesting, very early on when I was doing corporate training, when I started to come into the world of leadership development, way when, I remember I used to talk about taking risks, how important it was to be able to take risks at work. And I had a friend who really pushed back. And I think that sometimes taking risks is seen with almost like being reckless, actually. And I think there is a big difference. And unfortunately, in English, reckless and risk, they sound a little bit similar. So I think it's quite important that when we take risks, we can make mistakes. And risks don't have to be big as well. I think this is important, that a risk for me sounds quite a huge thing where things can go wrong, but sometimes they're small. And in taking risks, we are inviting the opportunity to make mistakes. And then we've got to know that that's going to be allowed if we want to progress things. I don't want to go into another rabbit hole, but that's just what came to mind. And talking of systems, because this is all about organizations that allow for failure. And just on a tangent, very quick one, in the first bit of the book, it compares the aviation system with the health system. And in aviation, when things happen, mistakes are more reported and learned from. And it looks like that industry also, because the mistakes are very visible. If something happens really badly in a plane and it crashes, that is a very visible failure. Whereas in health, it's not as visible always. And sometimes if the mistake is not admitted, then the only people involved are the very few individuals who are involved in that situation. Even that is quite interesting to think about. What are the industries that are learning and why from their failures? And so the book covers the discovery of DNA, the analysis of DNA in crime, and how when we started to be able to compare DNA and to analyze DNA in the crime scenes, we started to have lots of exonerations. We started to find that some people who had been put in jail actually weren't guilty. And of course, those of you who know me know I'm writing a cozy mystery. I love crime drama. I love books about crime, detective procedural. So of course, I'm very interested in this. But the important thing is that the author talks about when they started to do the DNA analysis in the crime scenes and started to use that in crime solving. Perhaps the most fascinating thing about the DNA exonerations is not how they opened the cell doors for wrongly convicted prisoners, but how excruciatingly difficult they were to push through. About how the system fought back in ways both subtle and profound against the very evidence that indicated that it was getting things wrong. And I'm getting this a lot from the book. It's full of examples where it's not like one person doesn't want to admit to their mistake. It's this whole system that doesn't want to admit that something is wrong. Why? Because then we have to solve it. And that takes a lot of energy. Isn't it better just to carry on as things were? When we are confronted with evidence that challenges our deeply held beliefs, we are more likely to reframe the evidence than we are to alter our beliefs. We simply invent new reasons, new justifications, new explanations. Sometimes we ignore the evidence altogether. Cognitive dissonance is the term coined to describe the inner tension we feel when, among other things, our beliefs are challenged by evidence. And I don't have the book to hand, but the term was coined by someone called Festinger. It is only when we have staked our ego that our mistakes of judgment become threatening. So it's really when we've put ourselves forward to doing something, and then if we've made an error of judgment, that's when we go, no, I wasn't wrong. And this is the domino effect of cognitive dissonance. The reframing process takes on a life of its own. And there are so many examples of this in the book about getting things wrong. And it's not that, I don't want to admit to my mistake in public, is that we're not admitting it to ourselves. And one example that, of course, people my generation and probably you listening have lived through is the whole Iraq weapons of mass destruction. And it has the example of Tony Blair. And without going into whether that invasion was right, wrong, etc., it's just looking at the evidence of weapons of mass destruction and how Tony Blair, who was convinced that they were there, he reframed the situation all the time as new evidence was coming up. And none of the reframing was, I might have got this wrong. It was, no, if it's not this, what probably happened is this. We didn't find the weapons. That's because we haven't looked deep enough. We've looked deep enough, they're not there. That's because they've been destroyed, so that's why we can't find them, etc., etc. I'll leave you to read the book. I like this. Heads, I win. Tails, I don't lose. I'll give you some more notes. Lying to oneself destroys the very possibility of learning. It is precisely in order to live with themselves and the fact that they have harmed patients that doctors and nurses reframe their errors in the first place. They block mistakes from entering conscious thought and narrow the definition of a mistake so that they effectively disappear or are seen as inconsequential. Then, this is an example of dissonance reduction. The doctors didn't want to admit their mistake to themselves. Dissonance reduction, I think I'm going to hang on to that one. And finally, around this, sometimes the most prestigious thinkers are the most adept at deploying the techniques of reframing, often in such subtle ways that it's difficult for us, them, or anyone else to notice them. Right, then it talks about the randomized controlled trial. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail into the examples that the author gives around this. But I think we need to remember this, especially in the area of health, when we're seeing studies, when there's studies that say that eating this thing or this vitamin is great for this X, Y, and Z. And to really think, okay, how has this been studied? And of course, it's really difficult in health because sometimes it just doesn't seem ethical to give some people the opportunity to get better versus others. Sometimes we have groups who've gone through a certain experience, but we don't have a group that is exactly the same that goes through a different experience or who experience life as a controlled group. So I think it's good to remember that. And it does talk about that. Funnily enough, it talks about the randomized controlled trial and how, whereas we have them in science, we don't have it in the criminal system. So it's interesting. It talks about a program called Scared Straight, which was basically, I know I wasn't going to tell you all these stories, but I think it's fascinating. It's basically about taking a group of young possible delinquents to prison and have them being shouted at by criminals and really make them see the reality of prison life and how this is supposed to deter them from being a criminal themselves. And how this program was very successful. There was a documentary about it. I think it won an Oscar. It was voiced by, I think it was Peter Falk, Colombo. And then later on, when they really compared what was happening, when they really looked into the effect of the program, they found that it didn't do that much good. But it's still going because the narrative actually of the program is great. Yeah, you expose these young people to the realities of prison, and so they never commit a crime in their lives. And the author is saying, even those with no prior commitment to Scared Straight continued to be attracted to the program, like moths to a flame. The hard data showed that it was counterproductive. But the narrative of kids being deterred from crime by mean-taking inmates was too seductive to ignore. I think we sometimes, definitely I do it, take things as true because they make sense. Okay, so you can read about Scared Straight there. I'll read this because actually it's something that I feel quite strongly about, which is, okay, I'll read it to you. The measurement period for a clinical trial shouldn't be the immediate aftermath of administering a drug, but the entire life of the patient. And the outcome shouldn't merely focus on a particular symptom, but the whole person. And I think we're learning this. We're learning that the body is such a complex system that even when we're trying to treat someone, just to look at one part of the organism might not be the best way of dealing with whatever is wrong with the person, because the whole person is affected. And I think I can't remember what this was in relation to this specific thing, but it was about something like, okay, if we do this kind of intervention in a person, it might look like we've solved it for now, but what happens 10 years later? What happens 20 years later? What happens to other factors of their life? So I think that is what that was about. I suppose the book just reminds us how difficult everything is. I'll finish with an example, saying I didn't have any. Yes, so as I said, I still haven't finished the book. I suppose I'm still in the kind of think like a scientist mindset. So I did want to share, just get my notes out again. Where's Trello? Yes, so I've got my notes now. Before I move on to that, I want to recommend, if you're interested in evidence-based and people changing their minds about things in science, especially in nutrition science, I can recommend the Zoe podcast, which I'm sure a lot of you listen to, just because I know some of you who listen to this. And the latest episode, so I'm recording this on 18th of March, has Tim Spector, who's one of the Zoe founders and also a very recognized, well-respected scientist. He talks about how he's changed his mind about certain things just because of new evidence coming up. So it's interesting, the Zoe podcast. What I wanted to share though with you is something that was done in Africa to try and solve poverty. So basically to try and bring children to increase the literacy and the education of children in a couple of regions west of Kenya. And they looked at what happened when they gave them free books. And what they found is they gave them free books and actually not much was changing around the educational levels. And it was only when they completely decided to look at it in a different way, when they gave them deworming medicine, that things changed. Because it's not that they didn't have access to materials, so they couldn't have a good education because they didn't have the right books, or they didn't have enough books, or they didn't have money to buy books. Actually, if they were ill, they couldn't go into school, or they were really uncomfortable, so didn't want to learn or couldn't learn, etc. And by looking at a problem of what can we do to improve literacy, well, let's not look at literacy. Let's go even deeper. What has to happen before a child is ready to learn? And by tackling that, they managed to make a difference. I recommend you read the book if this is of interest, because I've explained it quite badly. But what I'm thinking here, what I always like to think is that a lot of our problem solving comes from patching up mistakes. I think that's very obvious. And sometimes we just need to, I suppose, going back to the theme of failure and being wrong of the book, is we have to admit the possibility that we are wrong, of the possibility that we're even looking at the wrong thing. And it goes back to one of the earliest quotes, that failure represents a violation of expectation and is showing us that the world is in some sense different from the way we imagined it to be. And I think that last example, I think that's what it really shows. So I'll leave you with a final one. Failure is not inherently bad. It sets the stage for new ideas. And I love that last quote because, well, I've tried so many things in work, in life, and some of it have gone so badly. And I like this feeling of, well, it's not that it's bad. It's actually just left you open to new things. So I'll take that. I'll take that. So what have I got for you today? Well, I suppose, I don't know, talking of new things, is that what was that? No. First, I'm going to talk about reading because I finished 2 novels recently that I really enjoyed, and they're both courtroom dramas. So one of them is The Proving Ground by Michael Connelly, who I really like, and it's the Lincoln Lawyer series. And the proving ground is the place in court where you have to basically prove that your case is right. It's where you prove yourself as a solicitor, as a barrister, as a lawyer. And I really liked it. So that's called The Proving Ground. If you like courtroom dramas, that one might be for you. And then a different one. I never read anything by author Rob Rinder. And it's UK-based and it's London-based. So I love the fact that it's based in London because when it talks about Temple and some other areas of London, I can picture them. And I've been there. And it's called The Trial. And it's very different. This one is a junior lawyer who's just, well, he's not even junior. Can't remember if are they called apprenticeships? It's the equivalent, probably making a big mistake. I forget things very quickly because I read so much. But I really liked it. It's about this junior person. I'm talking about mistakes. It's really well connected to the Black Box Thinking book by Matthew Syed because it's all about this junior person. He's basically saying to his barrister, you're getting this wrong, man. And the guy's not having it. So that's the link. I'm also at the moment reading a sample. I always recommend people read samples of books if you've got an Amazon account or other ebook store. I'm reading a sample of Pandora's Jar, Women in the Greek Myths, which is about how women in Greek myths have been portrayed in art, in literature, and very interesting. No spoilers here saying they're not very well. So again, I think it might be worth reading if you're into that kind of thing. So from reading, going to writing, I've recently opened a new newsletter on the platform Substack and also on LinkedIn called Pilates and Remote Work. And it is exactly about that. And you know what? I'm really enjoying writing about Pilates. I didn't think I would, but in these first 6 posts that I'm writing, I've written 2 already, I take one principle of Pilates. I've done breathing and precision so far. I touch a little bit on that principle, what it means for the practice or how I come across it or something around that. Then I link it to an aspect of remote work. It might be online collaboration. It might be being a remote worker. Then I look at the science down the rabbit hole. There's that section where I just say, well, I thought this, but I don't want to take this thing that I hear for granted. I'm going to look and see if there is any scientific evidence. Again, link to the book that we were just talking about. And that leads me down an internet rabbit hole. So I bring out 1 or 2 papers that show something interesting. And then finally, I have an exercise in case somebody wants to do a Pilates exercise. And again, it's interesting just to break it down. I'm back to drawing. So I've got some stick men or stick women illustrating the exercise. So that's great fun. I've also been taking a Pilates class at City Lit in Holborn, which is an adult education institute. And I've really loved it because what I wanted to do was get away from my club. I have been attending the same place for Pilates lessons for, 15 years, something like this. And there is a certain style and a certain kind of Pilates that gets taught in that place. So I really wanted to go somewhere other than that place and experience something different. It was not as different as I would have hoped it would be. But then I took a class in Peace Studios in Battersea, and that was different. So I'm trying now to have different Pilates experiences because otherwise I'm not going to find my own way. I think I found my own take. If you're interested in me talking about that, then email me, pilar@virtualnotdistant.com, and I will talk more about it. And, I probably will at some point. And then finally, I've just been recording. The reason why I was a bit late with this podcast, with this episode, is that I had a very full-on week of voiceover work last week. The week before I was in Madrid, I did some new pickups, which is when you come back to something you've done before because either your delivery was not like the client wanted it, or more often than not, there's a new line or the line has changed. So I went to do some pickups for Go Jetters Go, I think it's called now. It's already been announced, coming in January 2027, I think. And it's a spin-off of the Go Jetters. Would you believe it? I'm not going to tell you any more about it, but I was doing a bit of that. Then I was doing a really, really nice job with 2 other actors doing an audio guide for Madrid. I'm not sure how much I can talk about that, but it was a great, fantastic job. I think I talked about it here when I did the first part. Beautifully directed. I learned a lot about delivering and I learned a lot about Madrid. So that was great. And then I did a random one. It's been ages since I got a call in the morning saying, Pilar, are you free this afternoon for a voiceover? It's like, yes, I happen to be, and I'm in town. So I did that. So that's all great. All right, I am going to wrap this up. If you have a book to recommend, let me know. Or if you have any notes that you want to pass on from a book you've read, then let me know. Pilar@virtualnotdistant.com. Finally, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.